When faced with disruption, companies often feel compelled to pause business plans. To the contrary, Karen Galivan argues they must continue to innovate. Welcome to BoardVision, the official podcast of the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. On this show, we share perspectives from leading corporate directors and discuss what makes boards effective, how they can help companies face challenges today, and become future-ready. This episode features Karen Galivan, a tax partner and board member at RSM US, which is a financial supporter of NACD. She speaks with NACD advisor Susan Paley about how boards and companies are handling disruption amid geopolitical uncertainty. They define what a disruptor is and discuss the practices and structures that can be put in place to create resilience. Have you heard about the benefits of NACD's certification program? Today's boards operate in a dynamic and rapidly evolving world. The National Association of Corporate Directors provides directorship certification that sets the standard for high-impact board directors. It's more than certification. This is the premier program, preparing directors to successfully navigate an increasingly complex business and governance landscape. NACD's directorship certification will enable you to demonstrate commitment, deliver confidently, and create real value for your organization. Learn more and apply today at nacdonline.org. And now, your host.
Karen Galivan, if any one of our listeners has been in a single meeting in the past year or more, we've heard the term disruption. And we know that it keeps a lot of executives and board members up at night. Now, you have several decades of experience working with a range of organizations, and I'm curious, can you just start with a level set of what is a disruptor? I mean, if I'm a leader at a company or even a staffer at that company, how do I distinguish between something being kind of a normal bump in the road, which just might occur in the course of doing everyday business, versus one that qualifies in this big category of disruptor?
You know, it's a great question because we really have been hearing that word disruption for a while now. I do think if you take a step back, what it really means is that any disruptor is something that's either going to challenge your traditional business model, maybe cause you to solve problems differently or solve the marketplace to solve problems differently. It could be a rapid growth in a new technology or things along those lines, or even just a new approach that wins that market share. Oftentimes people think disruptor, oh, it's technology, or it's always something that, is maybe AI or things along those lines. But if you really take a step back, it's really what is kind of challenging your traditional business model, and what do you have to now start thinking about to make sure that you can stay forward of that challenge?
Nice. You've really simplified that. So you're right. When I think about disruption, and many people probably are in this boat, they think, oh yeah, AI is a disruptor, or anything in the cyber world. It just invented itself in the past 10 years or 20 years. But if you take a step back, as you said, you looked at the long history of business, did Henry Ford and JP Morgan, did the original founders of organizations we know today experience the definition of disruptor in the way that you're defining it, do you think? Or is it something different that's evolved?
I think it's a little bit of both, quite honestly, right? Henry Ford, that's a great example, right? So if you talk to the horse and buggy industry, Henry Ford certainly was a disruptor in what he brought to the playing field. But again, I do think that as we think about disruption, the speed of it is so much faster than it used to be. So that's where I really think you see a big evolution, is that there could maybe be a disruption in certain decades or time periods. And I feel like in the last 10, 15 years, disruptors are much quicker and they're coming up much faster. You can even look at something as recent as the iPhone, how that really changed how everybody does business, how many businesses were developed because of the iPhone, whether it's the case or the camera or the lens or the chips. That's something that I think with recently was a huge disruptor, again, really changed the industry for a lot of different businesses.
Whatever came before the iPhone, the phones we were using then, those were like the horse and buggies of the communication world, right?
Right, for sure.
The iPhone upended everything. So I'm really going to be for a second landed on this historical view. Let's take another moment to look in our rearview mirror, because we don't have to look very far back for any of us, whether you're in the business world or not, to realize we lived through certainly a disruptor when we think about the recent pandemic. Many of us lived through the recession of whatever that was a couple decades ago. And if we talk to our parents or our grandparents, or even the founders of our companies, they went through the Great Depression. And I'm just curious, what lessons can any of us learn from a true disruptor? Do you have an example for us to listen to? You explain around what a board did to handle a disruption, either well or poorly, and what learnings emerged from that.
That's a great question. And it wasn't that long ago, right? Then everyone was trying to figure out what was going on during the pandemic. And I wasn't currently on the board I am now when it happened, but actually being in leadership in the company that I work with, I think one of the biggest things that we learned from it is you have to really lean on your company's values and behaviors to be successful in any disruption. And something as big as COVID that nobody knew how to handle, when we, again, take a pause, kind of put that foot on the brake and say, okay, what things do we have to think about? Now, some of the values in my company are things like respect and integrity and working together and excellence and having that impactful innovation, but also being stewards. So what our board and our leadership did during that time is every time something came up and things came up quickly that we weren't really sure how to handle, we made sure we were doing it on the bedrock of those values. You look at a lot of companies, you shut down altogether. Well, you didn't necessarily stop paying your employees. That wasn't the right thing to do. That wasn't caring about your employees. It wasn't caring about your communities. So in some cases, businesses really did have to figure out, okay, how do we still pay our people when they can't maybe come in? I looked at how we leverage technology, how so many companies leverage technology. I was a working mom through my whole career. And I remember, early in my career trying to convince people that it was okay if I did some work at home. And now everybody finds that they can accomplish so much at home based on the fact that we had to do it. And when we had to do it, we found out that, yes, it can be done. Now, is it important then to learn from that and get our people back together and working together in different ways, whether it's virtually or in person or things along those lines? But again, it went back to the fact of, okay, how do we really encourage our employees to be innovative? How do we take care of our customers? And oftentimes those big disruptions, while it's kind of panicky and scary as you're going through them, they're really an opportunity to try things that you never thought you'd try. And you really have to kind of, again, lean on those values. It also brings up things that maybe you shouldn't have done and mistakes that had to be made, but yet you make the mistake and you learn from it and you move forward. So, I do think that both our boards and our leadership, there's a whole bunch of modeling you can maybe do and stress tests and scenarios that you can plan for. But the one thing that you always have to think about is no matter what occurs, both good and bad, what do we stand for as a business? What do we stand for as a board? And what are those steps we're going to take to really show our values? What are those behaviors we're going to do to make sure that in any disruption, we're taking care of our stakeholders, we're taking care of our customers, and we're taking care of our people?
Two things bubbled up for me when you were talking. One of them is that you probably heard me let out a little chuckle alongside yourself when you talked about convincing a company you could do work at home as a working parent. I don't know if that seems sweetly antiquated now or just adorable. When we all think of that, I'm sure our listeners can remember that, what at a time seems like innovative thinking then becomes commonplace until finally it becomes a necessity that we can't live without. Of course, we saw that in the pandemic period. The second thing that bubbled up for me was that you talk about values, and indeed, like any one of us can look at our own character as an individual. And we know that the true test of our character is not when the sun is shining and we're in like some yoga lotus pose and all is well with the world. It's when we're triggered, right? In the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. And likewise, when a company, they may put their values on the wall of the lobby of the organization in that building and want to call upon them when things are well. But we really can quickly pivot and forget ourselves, right? When something happens as a disruptor. And you talked about the pace of change. So what does a company need to do to not forget themselves? How do they ensure that everyone around the board table is on the same page around using these values?
I think it's often talked about that the responsibility of the board from their oversight position is really making sure you take that fiduciary responsibility and that you challenge each other. And you really, again, I think it all goes back to values, right? Your values and your character as a person, but then also as that board of really challenging each other to think differently, to challenge the leadership to think differently, but then also to support your leadership during those times of extreme disruption. You should always support your leadership, but especially when there are things that are happening that have never happened before, or it's a crisis that you just weren't planning on, right? Those do happen. They don't happen often. I really hope we never have COVID or something like that again. But things that big, you can plan for to a point, but at the end of the day, you have to really be supportive. And so I think it just has to be almost habitual, a natural kind of thing of you're going to challenge and you're going to respect each other in that challenge and you're going to push forward. It also is important then to look back at what you've done and figure out, okay, what did work? Especially with any crisis, whether it's as big as a pandemic or maybe just as simple as something went wrong in a factory or something happened with an employee or things along those lines, those everyday kind of disruptors that aren't the normal course of business. How did we handle it as an organization? What did we learn from it? And how could we think about it better? So it's a real balance of keeping up with that pace of change, but also making sure to take time and reflect on what can be done better and what should be done going forward.
Excellent. So here are a couple of tools for our toolbox. I hear the duo of challenge and support. I hear doing a little Monday morning quarterbacking and taking a beat to reflect on what we've just done and how we can learn for future. So let's take it into the present moment. We're recording this conversation in the second quarter of 2025, and things are, as you say, moving rapidly. So companies are experiencing geopolitical and economic changes at a really rapid rate, maybe different from the way they've experienced disruptors in the past. What is happening in companies right now? How are they experiencing these? How are they or aren't they, in your experience, leaning on the values, the reflection, and the challenge support model that you just spoke about?
I think it's so industry dependent. And I also think there's a certain maturity in your business as to how many businesses are taking care of what is going on. Being in the service industry myself and talking to a lot of different businesses, in some cases, let's just, talk about tariffs, for example. People look around and I'll have conversations and they'll say, well, who knows what's going to happen, right? I don't know what's going to happen. But yet the really effective companies and boards aren't waiting to see what will happen, but are scenario planning around what could happen. And again, there are things I know that will come up that you never even thought could happen. And that's when you really have to go back on those values. But I do think healthy scenario planning is really important, especially as we are approaching what we anticipate to be a recession in the third and fourth quarters. And so it's going back to some of those basics too. Where are places we can cut costs? Where are places that maybe we can introduce technology to bring down costs? What does our cash flow really look like? So oftentimes it's the regular kind of business fundamentals that you should always be doing, but doing it with almost a different lens, right? Running those scenarios. What would happen if this happened? What happens if our supply chain falls apart? How do we handle that? And we can take some of the lessons from COVID, especially when we're talking about supply chain, of how do we look at that and how do we make those decisions? You also have to give yourself a little bit of patience. Again, it's a balance between having to make sure you have to make some of these decisions quickly, but in the same essence, looking back and saying, okay, what are our fundamentals as a business? How do we do this? What is the best case scenario here? I also think it's really important. Oftentimes when we start to get in recessionary periods or periods where there's global tension and things along those lines, companies will tend to pull back a little bit on innovation. And personally, I think it's really important to make sure that you don't stop innovating. And again, innovation doesn't necessarily mean expense. You don't have to always put in the most expensive solution, but innovation is people, it's process, and it's technology. And so how can you continue to encourage your organization to be innovative, even though there's these other stressors going on? But if you totally step away from that innovation, you're going to find yourself and your organization much further back because you haven't thought about what the future could look like.
I almost can see our listeners nodding vigorously, like, yes, you can't leave innovation behind, right? At your own peril. So you spoke about this idea of scenario planning being a must. And while I'm not sure if you actually said this out loud, but we all can imagine you meant too, is that you don't wait until the crisis or the disruptor to hit you to start scenario planning. This is a constant conversation, just like we don't start talking about succession planning for the CEO until we hear about them departing. It's in the agenda all the time. So in a world where the pace, we've just said, is so demanding in today's boardroom, and we are constantly struggling with the day-to-day, the quarter-to-quarter, I'm just curious how boards are making space in their agenda for this kind of scenario planning and retrospective reflection. Are they creating new processes? Like, is there a war room that happens every week or month in these boardrooms? What are you observing?
So what I'm observing really, and I think the key word is planning, right? So it really starts with that board agenda, making sure that not only are you making time for the day-to-day, but that you always carve out, whether it's in an executive session or maybe even putting some extra hours into those meetings when things are really heating up, to make sure that scenario planning is tight and that you're thinking of the different risks that are there. I think it's also super important in other boards that I've either been on or I have observed. You can't get the board information the day before the meeting. It's really important that you have that information a few weeks ahead of time so that the board has time to review it, to think about it, and then also match it up to what we're seeing that's going on in the economy or in the particular industry, et cetera. So I think planning takes on a whole new aspect with the speed of play. You have to plan first. It's really important. What I have also seen too is just a lot more touch points. So whether your risk committee is maybe rolling up their sleeves a little bit more than usual, or you're even setting up separate committees to think about some of these disruptors and some of these scenarios, it's really good to make sure that they're communicating on a regular basis and that they're thinking of these things so that when the whole board meets, we're ready to have deeper discussions. And there isn't a discussion on, oh, well, I need to learn more about that, or I don't understand that. You can still ask for explanations during that meeting, but I do think it's really important that you have to come in as prepared as you can be to every meeting that you have.
Yeah, when you talked about not getting the board book the day before, I think there are corporate secretaries the world over, telling you, yes, I get it. That's why my hair's on fire every quarter for about a week or two. So you mentioned increasing touch points, and I love this theme of communication because there's very little in life, I think, that can't be at least somewhat helped by good communication, although it may not be solved. And, in the NACD world, we talk a lot about that age-old mantra for board members of nose in, fingers out. And I just wonder, when you talk about increasing communication, does it also correlate with increasing the hands-on? Because I've heard some directors saying that NIFO, nose in, fingers out, has always been true. And yet, however, there are increasingly times when maybe more is called for. And in times of disruption, like we saw in the pandemic, I wonder if the board is meant to veer more into some territory it hadn't been in before. And how do directors know if my increased touch points and my increased involvement is A, needed in this board situation, and B, welcomed, and I'm not stepping on too many toes? When is it helpful? When is it disruptive itself?
I think the most helpful thing you can do, again, is make sure that your leadership and senior leadership understands that the board is supportive. And just because you're supportive doesn't mean you aren't going to be challenging and challenge with difficult questions, maybe make requests of leadership that they haven't done before, certain types of modeling or certain types of education or certain types of pulling in maybe experts that you hadn't pulled in before. I think those are the areas where the board probably is doing a little bit more but it's still not managing. You still have to trust your leadership to do the day-to-day, but you do just need to be there, whether it's assessing the own talents of the board members. So when you think about what are the skills that each board member is bringing to the table, if there's a skill that's not there, we have to be ready to bring that skill in and try to find that from an outside, whether it's an educational source, whether there's an expert we call in, whether it's time to change the face of the board. Those are all really important things, and the board has to be a little bit vulnerable and courageous to do those types of things. But that's where I see the board stepping in where it's effective. If you really start getting in there and getting your hands too deep into the weeds, it really, I believe, kind of creates distrust from your leadership. And you may overstep and not get their ideas as openly and honestly as you probably need. so that you can move the business forward.
I love your combination of vulnerability and courage while also sort of reading the room and reading the situation. It's sort of an intuitive, nuanced conversation sometimes.
Absolutely.
While we're sitting here in the conversation about the boardroom activities per se, we all know the only constant is change, right? Something is going to surprise us, always. So what processes and structures are boards putting in, or can they, in your opinion, be putting into place to oversee the disruption, withstand it, ensure that their enterprises are weathering that storm for the long term, regardless of whatever uncertainty might be held in the moment, and therefore tap into their resiliency, their values, and these best practices throughout the organization?
So I do think a lot of this, it's a combination of the full board being involved as well as the risk committee really making it a focus, right? Understanding what the risks in your industry are, understanding what the risks to the global economy are, and really making sure on a regular basis that everybody's up to date. I also think it's very important, the educational piece. There are so many disruptors and challenges that are coming and come on a regular basis that you may not have ever seen, even if you've had decades of experience. And so making sure to carve out that time before you even get in those meetings to try to understand maybe things in AI that you haven't understood, making sure that if it's a cybersecurity concern, for example, that you really understand from the IT folks what that could really mean. I just can't stress education enough. And that is leaning on your board members, maybe even leaning on other people outside of your board for big general topics. What do they know? Maybe it's a regulatory item that is new that's coming down the pipeline. So leaning on your general counsel to understand what that regulatory is going to look like. It's just very important to also get to know the key stakeholders of the entire organization and how are those things going. And you can't also, I'm listing a lot of things here, but it's also good to understand employee sentiment. So are you all running down a certain area thinking you're taking care of a disruptor or thinking you're taking care of something and you think you have it all buttoned up, but now maybe the key people in your organization or your employees who are kind of the lifeblood of your organization are frustrated and they don't feel like they're being communicated to? Well, the board needs to know that too, because oftentimes when there are so many things coming at you at once, you may not realize there's other things that could then be a disruptor because you weren't giving it the time and attention. So again, I'm a huge fan of information. I'm a huge fan of education. And I know that sounds really time consuming, but if you take that time up front, it helps the decision making on the back end go much faster.
I may have decades of experience as a board member or a chair and still not have seen some of these things that have come at me. And so it gives me an excuse to ask you to help define something for our listeners and myself that I've heard in the past. And it's about these labels that we've all heard probably when regarding risk and maybe disruptors. We've heard white elephants and gray rhinos and black swans and probably some other various colored animals. And I just wonder, for the unindoctrinated, what do these terms mean? What are the key risks that are associated with each of those?
I think I'll do just kind of a high level definition because I think it is important to understand what those are. And really a white elephant, it's either projects or investment that are really costly to maintain, but don't really offer any good value. And sometimes boards, and especially boards in leadership that have been in an organization for a long time, to me, these kind of feel like these are, well, this is how we've always done it kind of issues, right? This is how we really do it, and this is the way it should be done. But I do think that when you have a white elephant, you really need to sometimes look at that elephant in the room and decide, is this really what is still needed to help our business move forward? We talk about gray rhinos, and these are really those risk things that are high impact threats. I think it's interesting they call it a rhino because I also call this the elephant in the room sometimes, but things like cyber threats, things like geopolitical tensions, those things are always there, but oftentimes it seems like such a huge problem to solve that you don't ever give it enough time. And you have to know in your business that there is going to be some kind of cyber issue. And even if you have the best IT department in the world, there is always new stuff in that space. And so you always have to make sure that you're being nimble and that you're really almost attacking it like a cheetah instead of a rhino, because you really have to be nimble in that area. And I'll go crazy with the animal pictures here. So excuse me for being creative there. Black swans. This is really those highly improbable events, but that could have enormous impacts, right? So we've been talking all morning about COVID-19. That was definitely a black swan event. Or if you're looking at the 2008 financial crisis, another black swan event. But this particular situation that we're in now economically, with an imminent recession, with all the geopolitical tension that is out there and the tariff situation, this could also be a black swan. And again, I said earlier in our conversation, there's a lot of companies that say, well, I don't even know how to react to these tariffs because they keep changing every day. Well, you can't ignore it. When we have so much coming at us and there's all these different things, again, it really is important that you plan. And it doesn't mean that you're going to use every plan, but you just have to have some of those plans in place to respond to those things that you know could be coming. You know a cyber threat could be coming. We have a really good probability that a recession is coming. So when that happens, you can actually look at some historical things to give you answers to think about the future things. So I'll use the 2008 financial crisis as an example. That was a very particular crisis, but lots of people pulled back on their spending. There was lots of unemployment. There were different things that happened during that crisis that really led to a black swan event in the economy. Well, if we find that we're entering a recession or the probability of a recession is high, what were some of those things that we did during that financial crisis that we have to think about? And it goes back again to those business fundamentals. What does your cash flow look like? What does your debt look like? Are we thinking of all these things so that these kind of black swan events don't have to hit us by surprise, but that we understand the different levers that are available to us that we need to pull because there are so many things coming at us. So looking at your financial basics, really trying to understand, do we have all that set? Again, enhance that communication, enhance that education, and really just making sure that you have a resilient business. Does it mean your numbers might go down a little bit? Yeah, of course it could. But then if they do, are you going to be able to weather that storm? And what are the things that you have in place? Are you thinking about your innovation? Are you actively engaging your stakeholders? They have ideas because they're right in the heart of it too. So are we leveraging their thoughts and what they're seeing coming down the line? So, it's very interesting to talk about some of these things as very large animals. But if you, again, pump those brakes and think about what you need to do to keep your business on track, and as a board member, encourage your leadership to take the time to do that planning, to think about those things and figure out what those levers look like and how those levers, pulling which levers when, will help you weather that storm.
Thanks, Karen. That was a great comprehensive answer. I love the way you just summarized it by saying these very large animals. And I can't help but think of, I think it was the writer Anne Lamott, who I love. And she said, I think it was, how do you eat the elephant? Bite by bite. Or maybe it was bird by bird. Right? I think she said bird by bird.
One bite at a time.
Yeah. So it's all doable. And I have to just ask, when we think about, we don't have to go back to 2008 financial crisis. We can go back to 2020 when pandemic hit. And now we're talking about AI and cyber, and we're looking at tariffs and recession. If I just, came out of business school in 2020 and launched into a big career, I might think that disruption is never going to end. Are we in one protracted, long disruptive period, or is it a series of events?
I personally think it's a series of events. I think if you go back 10 years, 20 years, 25, 30 years ago, the disruptions that were happening then were very disruptive, whatever it was, to that business. So again, I do think it's faster. But I also think we have a lot more opportunity for solutions because you have things like AI, because you have advanced technologies that are coming down in cost. The education system that a lot of these business schools have where people are starting their careers from are excellent. And they're learning all these different things. And they're coming off of a period of COVID where they did have to learn differently. Some of them learned in their college dorms, some of them learned in their houses, and then they came back to class and things along those lines. So our new employees that are coming into the workforce have amazing skills that we need to learn how to leverage. And I do think that each kind of decade has its own disruptors. And while it feels overwhelming to us now, I'm sure it felt just as overwhelming historically as well. And so again, it's making sure that you're educated, making sure that you're open-minded, making sure that you're flexible, and knowing that you're not going to do it perfectly.
So in this conversation, we've reminded ourselves clearly that it is critical to plan. What's the famous line? The plan is nothing. Planning is everything. And you've made it clear that you don't wait until the 11th hour. You make it part of your conversations, even if it's uncomfortable, even if I've never experienced this before and it takes a stretch. So for my wrap-up question to you this afternoon, I wanted to ask you, if you had to predict in the next pick a period of time, let's just say 6 months or whatever you're comfortable saying, what do businesses have to be thinking about, planning for, and preparing around for the boards?
I do think in the next 6 months, we're going to really see that recession, right? You had a lot of people pulling inventory and spending money early in the quarter, and now they're going to start pulling back because everything is costing even more than they thought it did before. It's going to hit everything from our port employment to transportation to service, all those things. So there's really a few things that I think boards and leadership need to think about. The first and most important is really your financial planning and management. Are you managing your cash flow? How are you controlling your costs? How are you controlling your debt? And it may seem like we've talked about cost control since the pandemic, but it is always an exercise that has to be done, because even when things are going well, you certainly don't want to pay more than you have to. So again, those fundamentals I think are really important. We didn't talk a lot today about strategy, but that is really fundamental as well. Sticking to your strategy and making sure that you're doing scenario planning to protect that strategy. So what are those stress tests? Doing a little bit around what that stress test could be. What are your contingency plans? What is the contingency plan for a recession? What are some of those worst case scenarios? What do we do if we can't get that particular supply or material or something that we need? What are those contingency plans? Making sure that that planning is done. I think we have to become more agile, right? And what is that operational flexibility? Is it in the supply chain? Is it in our operations? Do we need to start bringing in maybe more technology? What kind of employees do we need then when we bring in more technology? What kind of skill sets not only do our employees need, but our leaders need and our board needs to make sure that we're making the right choices so that we can stay operationally flexible? And then finally, communication is absolutely imperative at this point. You need to communicate regularly, have those safe spaces to have those challenging and courageous conversations, and be transparent. Oftentimes when some of the news is bad, you can either overfocus on the bad or you can sugarcoat it, and neither one of those is the right way to do it. I think you just need to be transparent and be open to that thought innovation, to technology innovation, and really allow yourself to be an adaptable organization so that you can continue to succeed.
Karen, thank you so much for helping us think through what it looks like to be resilient in moments of and eras of disruption. You've given our listeners some great tools for their toolbox to handle disruptors no matter what animal form they may come in.
Excellent. Well, it was my pleasure being here today. Thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you.
That concludes this episode of BoardVision. We hope you enjoyed listening. Please subscribe and join us next time. Until then, visit nacdonline.org to stay informed about the latest resources NACD has to offer, such as memberships, certification, national or chapter events, and our content, including reports, articles, and Directorship Magazine. That's nacdonline.org. Thank you for listening.